Erev Tov, it's Erev Yom Yerushalayim. Tonight's Yom Yerushalayim. Tonight we're going to finish 5 minutes early. I know you're heartbroken, devastated, probably need emotional help after this. We're going to finish at 7:40 instead of 7:45. We're going to learn We're going to learn for Refuah Shlema. Chaim Dova Cohen Ben Yenta, all the Cholim, all the Ptuim, all should have Refuah Shlema. I'm picking up where I left off last week, but much more detailed starting this week. I told you last week that we were dealing with, I should take this off, this is shining off of the light. Starting in what was known as, came to be known later as the Golden Age of Spain. I mentioned two names last week only, Shmuel HaNagid and Chasdai ibn Shaprut. And we talked a little bit about them. But what I'd like to do tonight and into next week at least, we're going to do a different approach. I'll give you a name. We're going to talk about the person's biography, the contributions of the person, because everyone we're going to talk about, especially when we get to the Rambam, which won't be tonight, the impact that we have to this day on some names you've never heard of, or maybe you don't even realize you know of their work. So it's not just, these guys were really, I shouldn't say guys, these people were like great people in history. They were great people in what they wrote, but they haven't impacted us literally to this very day. So we're going to go one at a time. We'll start off with a slide. We're entering the Golden Age of Spain, and 50 points for anyone who knows what part of the world this is. It's Spain. Wow. Actually, at that point, it wasn't called Spain. It was called Al-Andalus, where we still use the word today is Andalusian. The type of class, let me try that again. Good evening. Let's start all. Hi, good evening. Andalusian type of music, which comes from there. They've been in this, and Spain has been in the news a lot recently, recognizing a pretend state called Fredonia, Narnia, and Palestine. And in addition to that, they've announced they're willing to take lots of refugees from Gaza. Let them have them all. Lazim gain, as they say in Chinese. But let's get back to here. We won't focus on politics. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a list of names of people we're going to discuss and the timeline of when they lived. You will see for the most part they overlap with each other, so that each one later in life would have had some connection with the other. Doesn't mean they lived in the same places. We're going to come to that. Maybe a couple of names you'll know, a couple maybe never heard of. Dunash ibn Labrat, which you don't even realize if you don't know his name. You have something to do with him. Shlomo ibn Gvirol, same thing. These aren't just names of streets in Rechavia. Bachya ibn Pakud, you also know, believe it or not. Yehuda Levi is one you probably have heard of. He's probably the greatest poet of Jewish history. Ibn Ezra as well. And the Rambam for sure you've heard of. Okay, so we're going to take these one at a time. Oops, I'm showing you something nice here. There, I make a nice little slide. I'm going to fly through it. We're going to start with Dunash ibn Labrat. So I'm going to take this off a screen share until we need the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about it. And again, the method's going to be talk about the person, their contributions, when they lived, and then the impact on us. And then we're going to take a look at some of their work. A couple of people will be just taking a look at a screen for something, and others are going to learn something together. So Dunash ibn Labrat, as you saw, he was born in 920. He was a poet. He was very much into grammar. We saw last week already, the Shmuel HaNagid was a huge contributor to grammar. And then in the time of the Gaonim, there was another individual who was very much into grammar. This is where in Jewish history, starting in Bavel and moving into this part of the world in Northern Africa and Spain, that you start to get a very heavy concentration of Hebrew grammar. It has a very big impact, literally until this very day. Anyways, he's born in Fez, Morocco, Dunash ibn Labrat. And again, I repeat something I said before when we talked about others. Ibn, I-B-N, not Evan. Ibn is the Arabic equivalent of Ben. The language of the people at the time was Arabic, and almost every single person you're going to hear about tonight and next week wrote in Arabic and Hebrew, including Dunash ibn Labrat. Anyway, so he has his education as a child in Fez. He's taught Hebrew and Arabic. So, wow, we learned Arabic. It's like saying, wow, we learned Hebrew and English. Okay, because at that time, again, that was the language of the people. It laid his foundation, though. He was so into the language. It laid his foundation for his love for the Hebrew language, for grammar, and poetry. He did a lot of traveling. He moved to Baghdad. At the time, it was becoming a great center of learning. Remember, just to keep it in perspective, this is literally the end of the downturn of Babylonia, and now we're an upswing in Spain. A lot of his work, a lot of his world view is actually shaped by the writings of Saadia Gaon. And I'm not going to go into how and what, but just understand this is a person that when we talk about Saadia Gaon already and his relationship with the Karaites and other things, we're going to move into how he also had influence in future generations. So what did he contribute? So I said he contributed big in both in terms of Hebrew poetry and grammar. He also, within poetry, he introduced into Hebrew poetry something called the Arab metrical pattern. I'm not going to get into that. For some of you, remember in high school you learned, or maybe college, iambic pentameter. There's different beats that a poem is written to. So he introduced something from the Arabic poetry to Jewish poetry, and it influenced heavily not only poetry in his time, but he had future effect as well. He moved, and we're going to see what exactly one of many things he wrote that you're going to be surprised, like, wow, I didn't know that. We'll see that shortly. He moves to Cordoba, now in Muslim Spain. Keep in mind that the Jews are under in a Muslim country, under Muslim rule. And for the most part, as we talked about last week, for the most part, they were actually fairly well taken care of. They had a status called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, which meant it's a person who couldn't rise in the ranks necessarily because he wasn't Muslim, but he still was protected by the government. So he was dhimmi, as were all the Jews at the time. And he was part of a vibrant Jewish community. These people did not work in a vacuum, whether it was Dunash ibn Labrat, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Bachid Bakud. All these names were not just like, they sat on a mountaintop and they communed with God and they wrote stuff. They were part of a vibrant community. He especially was involved in the intellectual and the cultural aspect of life. So what is it that he gave us in poetry that would be something you'll be familiar with? Mm-hmm. Hang in there. He is responsible for a lot of the Zmirot that we sing on Shabbat, or if you don't sing it, that we have on Shabbat. And let me show you something which you may or may not be familiar with. How do we know that Dunash ibn Labrat wrote this? Okay, so maybe we have some papers that's passed down from generation to generation. But if you look on the left-hand side of the screen over here, look at the paragraph. This is called an acrostic or kostichon in Hebrew. Daled, Vav, Nun, Shin, Dunash. Again, Derosh Navi, V'chulei, Dunash. Again, Dunash. Again, here he has Hadas, Daled, Vav, Nun, Shin. Throughout the entire thing, he has that kostichon or an acrostic of his name. It's woven into this. If you open up a bencher or a birchon next time on Shabbat, or even after class, and you have one that shows at the beginning who wrote what. Sometimes it says unknown. We don't know. Others, it's written very clearly. So this one is one we know, and make it so you can see it better. So you can see here, his name appears multiple times. This concept of using an acrostic, which is something I love to do, you'll find this. It comes approximately this time period of Jewish history, woven into poetry, into tefillah, into piyutim. For example, most well-known, of course, would be Lecha Dodi, where Alkabetz writes, Shlomo Alkabetz wrote Lecha Dodi. If you take the first letter of all the stanzas, it says Shlomo, Shlomo, right? And so that's very common. So that's on the one side of the screen here. We see his contribution to piyut, to song and poetry. On the right-hand side, you may or may not be familiar. Rashi quote. Now, Rashi doesn't live for about 100 years after him, but Rashi quotes Dunash ibn Lebrat, in many, many, many cases, sometimes just says Dunash, sometimes says Dunash ben Lebrat, sometimes Dunash ibn Lebrat. This is just from Sefaria. You'll notice there's a pasuk here. Rashi quotes, says Lashon, whatever the word was, says Lashon nituk. It's a concept meaning disconnection. Lashon aravihu, and it comes also is connected to the Arabic. Kidivrei Dunash ibn Lebrat. Rashi quotes Dunash ibn Lebrat. So he not only has an effect on the songs that we sing at the Shabbat table, but Rashi, he's such a tremendous grammarian who will have an influence on Ibn Ezra eventually, that Rashi himself quotes it. So that shows this the power of this particular individual that one person had. So even though we had a person whose name actually escapes you right now, we talked about 2 weeks ago, the time the Gaonim, who was very much into grammar, and we said had a tremendous influence, his name didn't seem to stay with us as is very popular. But the people he influenced, and then eventually someone like Dunash ibn Lebrat became popular enough that he and well known enough that his work is, like I say, quoted by Rashi. Okay. He was also involved in polemics. What's polemics? Political. They're intellectual debates, political debates, and what would be the purpose of this? What would be the purpose of those kind of debates? It was sometimes it was politics, but believe it or not, a lot of his public debates, whether it was in writing or speech or in any other method, revolved around issues of grammar and linguistics. You'd say like, oh man, what a bunch of nerd bombs, right? Well, these nerd bombs help us to understand Hebrew to this very day. Even Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern Hebrew, was influenced, of course, by all these people from this time period when it had to do with grammar. Because remember, there are words that didn't exist when he starts the rebirth of Hebrew. And he needed basis for coming up with the words. He uses Tanakh as the basis for the words he comes up with, but the construct of the word is thanks to Dunash ibn Lebrat and others as well. So you can see that he had a tremendous influence has a tremendous influence. And I will tell you honestly, he had a tremendous influence on me, because when I write, there are certain people I try to follow their style, not their words, and it's just called stealing. Hey, I wrote Dorati Yikra. I just changed the word. But their style, Ibn Ezra, Dunash ibn Lebrat, and others, to get ideas of how to come up with ideas. So it's really kind of cool when you think about this. Once again, it's important to understand that he did not live in a bubble, as most of these people in this time period did not. It was a lot of integration into the non-Jewish, the Arabic world, with them having a very good relationship. And it also, as I say, influenced some of their writing. It influenced some of the way they thought as well. So that's Dunash ibn Lebrat. We're going to move on to the next human being, and that's Shlomo ibn Gvirol. He is the end of Dunash's life and Shlomo ibn Gvirol's early days. They overlap. And who was he? And what did he do for us? And how does he help us? First, let's give a little background. He's born in 1021, as the slide said, in the city of Malaga. Again, that's in Al-Andalus at that time, meaning today's modern-day Spain, in the southern part of the country. Now, if we put a pause here for a second, let's try to imagine something. Let's round it off. We're in the year 1000. When we were growing up in the United States, that's, I think, pretty much everyone here on the screen, you learned the rhyme in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So if you start the sentence, say in 1492, most American Jews will finish the sentence, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But if you're good in history, you'll know that in 1492, Spain kicked the Jews out of Spain. That doesn't rhyme. So I guess it didn't make it into the top 10. But it not only the Jews kicked out of Spain, they were also, it happened to be on Tisha B'Av. And when we will talk about Bezrat Hashem, the expulsion of the Jews of Spain, I'm mentioning it now for a very specific reason. I have a book someone gave me by Rabbi Wein that's basically about history repeating itself. We say history repeats itself, and in his book, he proves this time and time again, that where you see example a Torah community on an upswing, then they're expelled, and there's a new place, and they're expelled. So here we've seen that time and time. We saw either expelled or there's a dissolution of the community. So here we see Spain now. We're about five, again rounding it off, 500 years in which the Jews are going to grow exponentially in terms of population, in terms of Torah, poetry, grammar, authorship. It's a massive, massive growth that, again, will influence, especially when we talk about the Rambam, because he has a tremendous influence on what happens with halacha, because so far, neither Dunash nor Ibn Gvirol have anything to do with halacha. Didn't mean they weren't involved in it, but they didn't promulgate, they didn't teach, they didn't write. Their writings are not connected to halacha. But so again, the loss, so okay, they expelled the Jews. Okay, what? They had 500 Jews and they expelled. They had a lot more than 500. They also had all kinds of tremendous tsaras before they were expelled. And it means also this tremendous upswing. And what happens to bring that to an end, we will see. We'll deal with it one day. But that's, take a look at 1920. Let's go to 1930. 1930, 1931, and you're in Europe. Okay, it's after World War I, it's before World War II. Go back even before that. And the Jews in Europe, they're thriving. There's a growth in Torah. There's a growth in writing. We have so much from that time period. And then decimation. By the way, decimation is wrongly used. To decimate means to reduce by a quantity of 10%, or deca, which means 10. But we use it colloquially to mean it was like utterly destroyed, even though that's not what it means. Okay, so let's go back to Shlomo Ibn Gvirol, also known just as Ibn Gvirol. He's born in southern Spain. His background, as far as what he came from, his knowledge, his education, his family, is not well known. And supposedly one of the reasons for that is he was an orphan at a very young age. His parents supposedly died, and it was left to people, relatives, community, whoever it was that raised him. But again, he's not only in the Jewish community, he's in a very culturally advanced, rich, educated community of both Jews and Arabs. And he becomes a scholar not only in Judaism, but also Islamic tradition. He learns Hebrew, he learns Arabic, philosophy, science. Why is this able to happen? Let's go back again to what I said last week or 2 weeks ago. That is under the influence of the Islamic rule, that this is the most, at this moment, one of the most powerful nations, one of the most rich nations, the most culturally advanced nations, and that's seeping into the Jewish world as well. And once again, his two main areas of contribution is in poetry and Jewish philosophy. He has a lyrical beauty, as it were, to the way he writes. His philosophy books were very detailed. There is one, probably the most well-known, now I'm saying that as if I knew it. I honestly did not know this until I was doing research. It's called Keter Malchut. Let me just show you. Okay, this is, sorry, he does, so this is, first one is one of his pieces of poetry. I should say, this is Keter Malchut, but it's written in a poetic fashion. Much in other words, what he did was he combined philosophy with poetry. I'm just going to read a couple lines to give you an idea. Niflaim ma'asecha v'nafshi yodat ma'od. Wondrous are your acts, and my soul knows very greatly. L'cha Hashem ha'gdula v'ha'gvura v'tiferet v'hanetzach v'ha'od, which we know this pasuk. L'cha Hashem ha'mamlacha v'naseh l'chol rosh v'osher v'kavod. L'cha broi mala umata ya'idu. Kihem ha'yovedu v'ata ta'amod. Without going into what this is, there is a daily piyut that's said by some, which is Yidun Yagidun Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. We give testimony and we say that God is one and His name is one. It's also an offshoot of this. What is this? This is a very long poem that some shuls in the Sephardi world will still read during Yom Kippur. Most shuls do not use this, as far as I know, and it's about our yearning for Hashem, the greatness of Hashem. That's what he did. So he took what sounds like just poetry and he weaves in philosophical ideas. In addition to that, he also wrote extensively secular poetry, which is very common. Even Rabbi Yehuda Levi and others, and Dunashib and the Brat. He wrote about love, wrote about nature, wrote about a personal reflection. Now, in his personal reflections, his poetry also shows a lot of pain, which is why there are people who say he did not grow up he didn't grow up with parents and he maybe had a difficult childhood. So that comes through. By the way, that's very common also with poets. If you even modern literature, if you take a short story, whatever it might be, and you then learn about the author, you can see that that person's writing is heavily influencing the way he writes or the story that's written. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples. So then I'll leave that to you on your own. But again, he also writes a regular book of philosophy. It was called The Source of Life, written in Arabic. It was called, here, I got the name here, Yanbu al-Hayat. I'm sure that you all are very familiar with that and have multiple copies signed on your bookshelf from him. In any case, he does a lot of relationships in there, discuss a lot of relationships, again, between the human and the divine, and between the sky, the cosmos, the human soul. It's not what I would call light reading, but it was also very controversial. It was controversial because it was very abstract. It didn't have really direct references to halacha, to Tanakh, to Masorah, to tradition. It was more, it sounded like it was like from his head completely. Nevertheless, what it did do, for those of you familiar at all with the church elders and the philosophers in the church at this time period of history, one of the most well-known, even I know his name, Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas or Thomas Aquinas, I don't know, which I think Aquinas is the right way to say it, was actually very influenced by Shlomo ben Gviro because of his writings. He had some, let's say, personal struggles and challenges within his own community because he was not towing the party line. Sometimes you will find in Jewish history, and even to this very day, that people who go against the tide, they swim a different way, they dance to a different drum, or whatever metaphor you want to use. Sometimes they turn out to be geniuses, and only centuries later they're understood. Great example, the Ramchal. We'll hear about him in the 1700s. Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the author of the Mesilat Yesharim and many other things. In his time, when he wrote it, he was living in Italy. He was run out of town, literally. And the book was not really well known until along comes a man named Rabbi Yisrael Salanter in the 1800s, founds what's known as the Musar movement, or about self-introspection, uses that book, and it becomes a worldwide hit, so to speak. So again, just because someone has something that's going against the tide, at that time period, sometimes it's not noticed until later. Believe it or not, some of you may know this, the Rambam's works were burned because people didn't like the fact he wrote a book of philosophy. We will deal with him next week or in 2 weeks, Bezrat Hashem. So the legacy, again, of Shlomo ben Gviro leaves this lasting mark on philosophy, on poetry, within the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world. Along comes another man, Bachya ibn Pakud. Oops, hey, let's make it small so you can see the name. Okay, Bachya ibn Pakud, or Bachya, the son of Pakud, lives in 1050 to 1120. What is he known for? Let's talk about this. First, a little bit again of him, about his background. You know, I'm kind of like just rattling off these names, dates, and who they were and all. But you also have to keep in mind something. First of all, there are many, many, many others names I'm not even mentioning. You could probably take this time period, couple with 50 names. But that how Hashem planted, in quotes, planted these incredible human beings, one after another, who influenced the next one and the next one and the next one. It's just, it's mind-boggling. You get into other time periods of history. It was the time periods of Chassidut, the beginning of the Hasidic movement, where you come into the time period of the Rishonim, which we're really entering shortly. It's just amazing how many tremendous Gedolim are in one spot and how their influence is. Because you think about it, the time of the Gaonim spans about 500 years. There's multiple, it's mostly in Bavel, as we've seen, in Babylonia. But it was time over a very great time period. But there weren't we had a lot of names of Gaonim, but they weren't necessarily the greatest of all. There were some very important ones we spoke about. But here it seems like almost any name you pick out of a hat, that was living at this time, who was a Rav, poet, or grammarian, or philosopher, falls into this category. But I'm picking out just a few of these names. So let's talk about Bachya ibn Pakud, because he has a magnificent influence on us today. He was, like his friends, the others who come before him, he was a philosopher. He was a Rav. He was actually a Rav. And what he was also was what we call, I think the right word is, I think there's such a word, ethicist. Because he dabbled, not dabbled, he worked in the area of ethics. Let's jump ahead again, because you can't do Jewish history in a vacuum. You need to compare. When I was learning for Smicha in the 18th century, around the late 1970s, I'm pretty sure the very first real book that came out in English, at least, about Jewish medical ethics was by Lord Jacobowitz Zatzal in England. She was the chief rabbi of the UK, and it was one of the earliest, if not the first, I could be wrong, English books on Jewish medical ethics. It spawned a massive, massive amount of literature, of books, Hebrew and English, about Jewish ethics, medical ethics, whether it's end of life or anything else. The same thing is happening now at this time with Bachya ibn Pakud. His book, his concept about ethics is very important. It's also his philosophical items. But what is it that he contributed that is so important to us? Okay, so some of you know, and you've heard of him known as a different name. You've heard as Rabbeinu Bachya or Rabbeinu Bachaya. That's who this is. That's one thing. Okay, we're going to take a look at two things. Actually, before I go there, let me explain what we're going to see. He wrote a book that many of you have in your library or may have learned called Chovot HaLevavot or Chovos HaLevavos, which literally translates into English as Duties of the Heart. He is the author of that book. One of the first books of philosophy that looks at our requirements that we have to do, not just in terms of we have to light Shabbat candles, we have to keep Shabbat, and we have to, not just the physical things, but the heart mitzvot. Let's take a look at this. Okay. Rabbeinu Bachya, this is like an introduction to his book, written about it. Rabbeinu Bachya hivdil b'sifro ben chovot ha'evarim. Rabbeinu Bachya distinguished in his book between the limbs requirement, meaning the physical things we klomar hamitzvot hama'asiyot hamutolot al ha'udim, the physical mitzvot that we have to do. What is, like, again, taking challah, taking trumot masrot, whatever, keeping Shabbat. The vein chovot halavavot. And on the other hand, he was the first one to write a book that had to do with duties of the heart, chovot ha'akara v'harigasha, things that we have to be aware of, things that we have to feel, shehein mitzvot ha'emunah v'adirushot ha'musariyot, that they are the mitzvot that have to do with belief in Hashem, trust in Hashem, and our requirements of ethics, to be ethical. Musari means ethical. And he stresses that this is even more important than the first thing, meaning the chovot halevavot, how we relate to Hashem, our belief, our emunah, our regesh, our feelings are even stronger and more important, I should say, than the mitzvot we do physically. He says like this, for example, we have a mitzvah, constant mitzvah, to believe in Hashem and to trust in God. We have to do some introspection. We also do tshuva. On top of all that, to love Hashem. So he goes on to explain that the book is divided into 10 sections, 10 parts. I'm only going to mention a couple of them. I'm not even putting them on the screen. I have it here written down. One is called Shar HaYichud. It's probably the most. I taught the book once, years and years ago. I would teach Shabbat morning for like 20 minutes for davening. It's the first chapter, Shar HaYichud, about the unity of God, as you can well imagine, is very, very tough. It's not anything that you've read. If you've never really dabbled at all in the idea of Jewish philosophy, it's a very difficult book to deal with in the first chapter. It gets, quote, a little easier after that, but the first chapter is tough. So he deals there with the idea of monotheism, philosophical arguments for the existence of God, for the oneness of God. Again, very light reading. He has one on Avodat Elokim, service of Hashem. How do you serve Hashem? Not just by davening, not just by doing mitzvot. How else you can serve God? He talks about Shara Tshuva. It's not Sharei Tshuva that's written by somebody else. It has to do with the Rambam, but it's not written by the Rambam. Sharei Tshuva. So all these are really philosophical approaches to topics. What was groundbreaking again? Again, it's the first book that deals with. Now, there's remember, keep in mind, this is before the Shulchan Aruch, for the Rambam, before what was known as the Tur, which if these terms mean nothing to you, that's okay. We're going to get to them. This is way before there's any real book of halacha. This is after the Mishnah, after the Talmud, after the writings back and forth of the Gaonim, but there's still no book of philosophy dealing with how should I feel as a Jew? How do I approach God? There are people who will be able to go their whole lives and never open a book like that, and they're fine with it, and that's okay. It's an what's the word I'm looking for? There's an expression, and I don't remember what it is, but basically, there's a part of you never explore. It's like an unexplored part of you. Imagine you have a car, and you have things in the trunk and things in the back seat. And you drive around your merry way for years with the same car, never open the trunk. Just happens to be that you have, a good few hundred gold coins in there. You don't even know it. It's okay. It's in the trunk. I don't need it. Who needs it? I don't open the trunk. It's probably dirty in there anyways. I'll deal with the stuff that's in my car day in and day out. I'll put my groceries. I'll take my groceries. I drop some money in there. I put the money up. But in the trunk, you're carrying around some gold coins. Who needs it? And I understand there's a perspective that people say, what do I need that for? I'll do the mitzvot. The point of this book is chovot halevavot. We have mitzvot that are not incumbent on us by action, but by feeling. So that's the story of his book is, and that's a book that's learned, like I say, till this very day. There's something else. Okay, so I'll leave that. I'm not going to get to Rabbi Yehuda Levi. Well, maybe we'll talk a little bit about him. But the other thing is Rabbeinu Bachya, again, Bachya ibn Bakud, is his commentary on Torah. You won't find him in a Mikrot Gedolot Chumash, but you'll find in separate volumes, just Rabbeinu Bachya ala Torah. Some of his writing is very, very clear, very succinct, and he really paints a great picture and explains. And sometimes I'll have no idea what he's saying. And that's okay. I mean, it's not anything about him. When you read something from someone like him, or the Rambam, or the Ramban, or Rav Kook, and you don't understand it, doesn't mean that he's wrong. It means that there's something missing. You need to figure out what he's trying to tell you. So, as they say, the chisaron, the lack is in me or in us, and not in the author. If you have someone who's not on that level and writes shtuyot, okay, that's a different story. So again, his legacy, really, we could call it his legacy, is teaching the Jewish people for the last 1,000 years that we need to be just as concerned, if not more concerned, about how we feel in relationship to Hashem, and to explore that more so than even halacha again, there's a mitzvot. He's not making this stuff up. There are mitzvot of doing an actual physical mitzvah. Classic example, first of the 10 commandments. Remember, they're not, I don't remember who the line is, but it says they're not the 10 suggestions. But the 10 commandments, technically, it doesn't mean 10 commandments either. It just says the 10 statements. So the first one says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the Lord your God. I shall say, Ticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of Egypt. Question is that a mitzvah? Or is that a statement, like an introduction? And there's a machloket. There's a dispute. One opinion says it's a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? To believe in Hashem. You have a mitzvah to believe in Hashem, emunah b'Hashem. The other opinion says, if I'm not mistaken, the second opinion is Ibn Ezra. It's not a mitzvah from the Torah. He's not saying a mitzvah. All he's doing is he's introducing himself. Hi, I'm God. I'm your Lord. I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. Here's my rule. So there's a big difference. But most seem to indicate that first statement, Hashem Elokecha, is in fact a mitzvah from the Torah to believe in Hashem. And there's so many mitzvot that are based on just thinking, our minds, or feeling. Again, ve'ahavta, it's not ve'ahavta. Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha v'chol nafshecha v'chol me'odecha. You should love Hashem with all your heart, all your might, and all your soul. What does it mean? Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. What do? I say, okay, I take this chain and I put it around my neck, and I say, I'm thinking about the people in Gaza. That's how I love Hashem. No, not at all. What is love? Imagine you say, what's the love for your spouse, your love for your parent, love for your child, love for your whoever, your siblings. Say, well, I'm going to put a little sign up that says, I love my mom. Okay, that's very nice. But where is that love? It's internal. It's a feeling. And that's the idea of that's the point of the book of Chavot HaLevavot. If you don't own the book, you can always go online to look and read it online. Again, Sefaria is an unbelievable resource. It's available in Hebrew, it's available in English, and the actual book is available in multiple languages. And on the assumption you're talking Hebrew and English, it's available in there. And I would highly recommend at some point in life, read, skim, go through it, listen to, I'm sure there's many classes online you can listen to about it. I don't have any plans at this point in my life to teach it. I have enough other challenges. I don't want that challenge. But okay, so let me kind of summarize here. We talked about a few individuals, and we have a few more to talk about next week. The people that make up that time period of history. There are people who lived in the year 500 that we are still reaping the benefit, the Talmud. There are people who lived between 500 and 900, we reap the benefit. Many of Halacha, the birth of Halacha, starts in time of the Gaonim, we're still reaping the benefit. And sometimes we have people who lived and were so powerful and so instrumental in our with their legacy that we're not even aware. And that's part of what I wanted to show you tonight. And we have more next week. But it was that because of their authorship and their grammar and their piyutim and their philosophical works, that's something that's still in your house every single day. So next time you open up again your Birchon, take a look. There are many other authors of the Shabbat Zvirot, but those are again like Duna Sheb Labrat has a lot of them. And sometimes it's fun when they don't say a name. Take a look and see if you see an acrostic. See if you see another. Sometimes just the name is built in the first few words. It's a lot of fun. At least I think it is. Okay, as I mentioned, we're stopping a little bit early. I wish you all a Yom Yerushalayim Sameach tonight and tomorrow. We should have a wonderful evening tonight, good day tomorrow with all kinds of Besorot Tovot, and a hostages. That's what we need. Tov, Laila Tov, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And a Chag Sameach. I don't think
Thank you. Oh, nice to hear your voice. Welcome.
Next
All
week,
right.
no class.
What's that?
No class next week is Shavuot.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so I guess there's no class. Good point. No class next week.